Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome to this new tutorial series in which I'm going to deconstruct Arturia's implementation of the Oberheim Matrix-12 synthesizer, released in 1985. This was the end of a line of lineage of pretty amazing synthesizers, stuff like the SEM, the OB series from the late 70s and early 80s. And this was the last and most powerful of all of the synths that Oberheim produced during that period of time. A 12-voice multi-timbral synthesizer, really very powerful indeed, as powerful as a synthesizer was in that day and age without being modular. We've got pretty impressive lead sounds like this. And we've also got really beautiful pads. I'll just give you one other quick demonstration of a multi-timbral sound. So this multiverse, you can see it's taken us to the multi-page, and we're going to get multiple different completely different sounds all patched together, playing lots of different voices simultaneously. See all those green lights? Every one of those green lights is a different voice. Really beautiful synthesizer. Over the course of this series, we'll deconstruct it section by section and really figure out how the thing works. If you enjoy this series and you want to help support my channel, check out the Patreon and YouTube channel member links below. It's a fantastic way to help me carry on making content like this. An enormous thanks to everybody who has so far. And we've had two very short snippets of lovely sound, and now we're going to go back to our old familiar friend, the sawtooth. Not quite so impressive, but that's where we need to start. Today we're going to have a look at the oscillators, the generators of sound, and we'll also have a quick chat about the amplifiers at the end of the synthesizer. We've got two separate amplifiers, and we'll have a look at those as well. But first things first, let's have a look at the oscillators, and there are these sections up at the top. I basically want you to ignore everything that we're not dealing with in this kind of sectional deconstruction of the synthesizer, because we're going to plug all of those other sections together later so as not to overwhelm you. Today we're primarily just looking at this section above. VCO stands for voltage controlled oscillator, and we've got two of them. So these are the things that make sound. At the moment, only oscillator number 1 is doing anything. It's generating a sawtooth sound. Over on the right hand side, we've got some analysis tools that are really going to help us see and hear simultaneously what's going on. So if I press a single note, you can see that I've just pressed a C. It's oscillating at 257 Hertz, which is a little bit flat for a C actually. And then you can see in the oscilloscope that we've got a sawtooth wave. And right down at the bottom, we have Insight, which is our spectrum analyzer, which is showing us a breakdown of all of the harmonics that go to make up that wave. And that's pretty much what a sawtooth looks like with this gently sloping linear curve. I'm going to turn the sawtooth on and turn the triangle wave on. And there's exactly the same notes being played, but now it sounds completely different. And as you can see in the oscilloscope, it's generating a triangle waveform. Finally, we've got pulse up at the top, which at the moment is generating a square wave. So a pulse wave that has a 50% duty cycle, in other words, it's on 50% of the time and off 50% of the time, is also called a square wave. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit on our oscilloscope so that we can see that a bit more clearly. And the unique thing about pulse waves is that duty cycle, the width of the on and off sections of the wave, can be varied, and we can do that using a control called pulse width, PW. And there you can see on the oscilloscope the width of the wave varying. If you double click any control in an Arturia product, it sets you back to a default value. Let's double click on the pulse width knob and see what we get. We're going to get 31, which is a kind of a seemingly curious number to choose, but basically the majority of the controls in this synthesizer range from 0 to 63. So 31 is basically half, as close to half as you can get in whole numbers. To the left of the pulse width knob, we've got a couple of controls that allow us to determine the pitch of the sound. Now remember when I pressed that C a little bit earlier, I said it was a little bit flat. It's because a C should be at about 261 point change, hertz. So at 257, it is a little bit flat. Let's fix that right now. Up at the top of the synthesizer, we've got some master controls that affect the entire synthesizer, and one of them is called fine tune. And on my synthesizer, I've not touched this knob. This is exactly how it's come out of the box. I'm not quite sure why, but I'm detuned by 0.292. So I'm going to double click that and set it to 0.5. And now when I press the same note, we should get 261 point something. Beautiful. Okay, so that's much closer to a perfect pitched C. It's actually still 4 cents short. Shall we fix that as well? Let's use the detune, which is used for very fine-tuned control. And there we go. So if you want it to be absolutely cent perfect with the pitch of your tones, that's how you do it. Now each one of these C's is exactly where the tuner says it should be. I'm just going to double click it. I don't mind it being slightly detuned. The frequency knob allows us to step up and down in whole semitones. So at the moment you can see that the frequency is set to 12. Let's double click this knob and see what we get. So the default for this particular control is actually 0. We started with the init preset here. It's in the template folder. Basically, if I ever want to get back to a completely flat start, this is where I would go. That preset itself had its tuning effectively tuned up an octave. Now that we've gone down to 0, I'm going to press the same key on the keyboard. And now it's 1 octave lower than it was previously. Pretty obvious what that's doing. Finally, in the VCO1 section, we've got our master volume control. Now, hopefully this is beyond the need for description, but, you know, lo and behold, it's your master volume control. The reason why it's important to know that it's there is because you might have 2 different oscillators, and I'll do this shortly, generating different waves with VCOs 1 and 2, and you mix them together using your 2 volume controls. They then go on to other components in the synthesizer, and it's important to get that balance right. So it's not just a case of whapping this thing up to 63 and calling it done. You will want to use it as a little mini mixer when you're merging 2 different oscillator sounds together. Speaking of VCO2, I'm going to turn VCO1 off and press a key on the keyboard, and you don't hear any sound. VCO2 is fully operative. You can see that its volume is set to 63. The reason you're not hearing any sound is that none of its waveforms are currently engaged. So let's turn it into a triangle wave, and now there's oscillator 2. Now the 3 controls to the left are identical to VCO1, so we don't need to go over those again, as are pulse and saw. But with VCO2, we also get a noise generator. Let's have a listen to that. Every key that I press on the keyboard now is going to sound exactly the same. That's because noise is all of the frequencies all of the time. This is an unfiltered noise. I'll just press a single key again. See that completely flat response on the spectrum analyzer in the bottom right hand corner. That means that none of the frequencies are being attenuated. So this is white noise. There's a thing called pink noise, where basically you apply a filter to the upper frequencies and cut some of them away, but that's not what we're getting here. As we go further into this video series, I'll try to find opportunities to show you that noise isn't just an annoying irritant in the background. It can actually be used as a really important sound sculpting tool in its own right. But for today, we're not going to play with it. I'm going to go back to the triangle. In fact, with Oscillator 2, let's do something that we haven't done so far, which is engage 2 different sounds, 2 different waveforms simultaneously. So I'll turn the triangle and the sawtooth on at the same time. Oscillator 1's still off, so we're only hearing Oscillator 2. Have a look at what this looks like in the oscilloscope. So we've got this kind of notched shape now. That's a combination of a triangle and a sawtooth. Come down an octave so we can see it a little bit clearer. There we go. Now that's a very interesting sound, but it's not as interesting as the sound that I'm going to generate with the next feature called Sync. When I press this button, at the moment it's not going to be particularly dramatic. But But watch what happens when I increase the frequency of our completely unused VCO1. This shouldn't be having any effect on the sound at all. Just go up by a single semitone. And it's gone up by a semitone. Why is the pitch changing when I increase Oscillator 1's frequency knob? Well, it's because Oscillator 2 has been slaved to Oscillator 1 via this process called hard sync. So VCO2 is now a slave, VCO1 is the master. In other words, VCO1 is in control of the output pitch of the tone. VCO2 has effectively become a tonal control. So when I change the frequency of the oscillator that you're hearing, listen to the different tonal effects. And don't forget, we're a semitone sharp here at the moment, so you're going to be hearing different flavors of C sharp when I press the C on the keyboard. Every now and again you'll see a G. That's kind of a false reading because the tuner simply can't work out what's going on. It's too difficult for the tuner to parse this particular sound. I'll explain it in a moment. What's happening there is that the Oscillator 2 is trying to generate its waveform. It's a complex combination of a sawtooth and a triangle. But Oscillator 1 is in control of the pitch. In other words, VCO1 is in control of how many times a second an instruction is delivered to VCO2 to say start again, start again, start again. And you can actually see it reasonably clearly in the oscilloscope. You'll see a complete wave be drawn, a waveform be drawn, and then the beginnings of the next one. And then it gets basically cut short and set back to 0, and then the waveform starts drawing again. If I freeze the oscilloscope, you can see the waveform being drawn, and at a particular arbitrary point in time, determined by VCO1, this instruction comes along to say start again, and it begins redrawing its wave. And so this complexity in the wave up at the top where we've got this twin peak is where all of that extra harmonic information is coming from. Take it out of sync mode. That's what the oscillator looks like all on its own. That's what happens when we sync the two together. So it's a pretty complex kind of mathematical thing that's going on in the background, but the cool effect that we get is that VCO1 turns into a tuner, VCO2 turns into a tonal control. If you worry about it from that perspective, just from the perspective of making music and interesting sounds, we don't need to particularly concern ourselves with the intricacies of what's actually going on. I've just set both of these oscillators to flat, so we've taken away all of our frequency and detune, we've turned sync off. I've got VCO1 generating a pulse, VCO2 generating a triangle, and they're both on. So let's have a look at that. And you can see we've got this complex wave being comprised of a pulse plus a triangle, but each oscillator is contributing one of those waveforms. It would sound the same if I had the same oscillator do both jobs. So there's oscillator 1 generating a pulse plus a triangle, and here's each of the oscillators contributing one of those waveforms. But every time I press the key, we stand a chance of getting a slightly different variant of the wave. It's because these oscillators are cycling independently, that it's a virtualized analog synthesizer, so you're not guaranteed to get exactly the same sound every single time you press the key. Once the key's pressed, it'll do that thing consistently. But this is the beauty of analog synthesizers. They're not digital, they're not absolutely military precise all of the time. There's very often workings spinning away in the background, and very often what you get is the effect of kind of jumping on a moving train. Depending on where you jump onto the train, you're going to basically get a slightly different flavour of the sound. We can now obviously mix these two sounds together, and that's all pretty straightforward. Now once those sounds are mixed together, we're ignoring this little section down here at the moment. We'll deal with that in the next episode. And we're also going to jump over the filter section just for now. I want you to ignore that. We do, however, want to have a look at the amplifiers. We've got these two voltage controlled amplifiers at the end of the chain. So this is the very last point right here where my mouse is. This is effectively the end of the chain as far as the signal path is concerned. Immediately after this, it's going to go to the outside world. Now you could be forgiven for thinking, well, the reason I'm hearing sound is because VCA1 is turned up. Well, that's not strictly true. VCA2 is doing a really important job here. It's the thing that's controlling the on-off nature of the key. When I press the key down, you hear a sound. When I let the key go, you stop hearing the sound. That effect is coming from VCA2, not VCA1. Now, this is a subject we'll deal with in a couple of episodes' time, but that's because this amplifier here is tied to something called an envelope. And as a very brief preview of what we'll see in episode 3, when we deal with envelopes, you can see that envelope 2 is mapped to VCA2. If I take that mapping away, you won't hear any sound anymore. Let's try it. I'm going to explain everything that's going on here eventually, but just for now, I've destroyed that mapping between envelope 2 and VCA2, and now when I press a key on the keyboard, we don't hear any sound. And that's why I wanted to mention it right up at the front, because it's really easy to think that VCA2 isn't doing anything, it's turned all the way down. The situation's not quite that straightforward. Over the next couple of episodes, we'll demystify that process entirely. Just wanted to raise your attention to it now because it's a little bit counterintuitive and the readings that you see on these two amplifiers aren't completely straightforward. But that's quite enough of teasers for future episodes. We're done for today. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Please hit like if you did, and I'll see you for the next one. Thanks very much.